Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 8th, 2024. If you saw the update yesterday, I was speaking about the importance of recognizing the 200th anniversary of the premiere of Beethoven's magnificent Ninth Symphony, which took place in Vienna. The importance of that can be seen in thinking about the struggle Beethoven had in his time with the forces of what we would call today hybrid warfare, suppression of ideas, of free speech, and so on, that he had to face in his day-to-day life after the 1815 Congress of Vienna. Now, it's important to note that one of the major stories about the Congress of Vienna was a book by Henry Kissinger called The World Restored, in which Kissinger writes about how the British worked with the Austrian Empire through Metternich to impose a censorship, which Kissinger said was necessary to bring about peace in Europe. And this was his whole theory about balance of power and how the British were clever in using the Russians to threaten to suppress rebellion against the empires. And it's a very complicated mess, but you can see in it what shaped the thinking of Kissinger, who was a committed liar for the sake of the so-called balance of power. Now, what's important to note in looking at this is that the Ninth Symphony was performed in 1824 from the period of 1815, which is when the Congress of Vienna took place at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, until 1824, Beethoven had no major works. There was a suppression. The Carlsbad decrees in Germany threatened the freedom of expression. Poets were sent to jail. The whole idea of the American Revolution, which people in Europe saw. Schiller was very much attracted to the ideas of the American Revolution, as were people like Mozart and Beethoven. But these ideas of freedom of expression and free speech, the idea of a republican constitution, threatened the oligarchical powers of Europe. And so what we see in that period was the emergence of a dictatorship. And this was a period which saw the beginning of the power of the British Empire to impose its will throughout the world. Now remember, in 1776, the American Revolution, as an anti-colonial rebellion, defeated the British and represented an ideal to the world. But this threat was, the British encountered this by launching a strategy of divide and conquer, which later became known in the 20th century as geopolitics. But let me just review a little bit of this to give you a sense of what this fight was about. And when I go through some of the wars the British were involved in, the British Empire was involved in, think about the situation in the world today with the war in Ukraine, with the ongoing confrontation in Gaza, the threats to China. It's the same geopolitical strategy. Only this time there are nuclear weapons at stake. So the British wars to protect colonialism included war against China, two wars, the Opium Wars, one 1839 to 42, in which the Brits brought the French in as a partner, and then again 1857 to 59. What were the Opium Wars about? The British enforcing the purchasing by the Chinese of opium from India. And why did they do that? Because this was British free trade policy. The Brits were importing a great deal of goods from India and China, and they needed something to balance the payments. So they imposed the opium traffic on China. And when the various Chinese leaders rose up against it, the British sent the Royal Navy all the way around the world to suppress the rebellion and to reimpose the drug policy that gave them a favorable balance of trade. And by the way, doped the Chinese people so they wouldn't rebel. Second example, the so-called Great Game, which was the struggle against the Russian Empire, mostly in Afghanistan, but you could extend the idea of the Great Game to virtually every one of these conflicts. There were British troops fighting Russian troops in Afghanistan beginning in the 1830s. And what was the issue? The Brits were protecting the Indian subcontinent because they feared the Russians would use the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan as an entry point into what today is Pakistan and India. And so, and why was this such a threat? Because it was the British East India Company which dominated the Indian subcontinent and which needed to protect it for British continued colonial looting. Now, in the same period, you had the famine in Ireland, the 1845 to 1852, in which 1 million Irish died and 1 million left the country. And why did this happen? Primarily because of the British free trade policies, which were imposed on Ireland, which meant that most of the food that was produced there had to be exported. And as a result, they were dependent on potatoes. There was a potato blight. It's more complicated than that, but essentially it was a British genocidal policy or a Malthusian policy against the people of Ireland. You had the Crimea War from 1853 to 56, which was another war of the British Empire against the Russian Empire. And what was the issue? Who would control the Black Sea? And again, the British went to war. The French were their sidekicks there. You see the French repeatedly joining with the British. And this was also bringing the Ottoman Empire in on the side of the British, which later the British realized the Ottoman Empire was collapsing and they needed a replacement for it. And that's where, in the 20th century, you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France to carve up the Middle East, and then the Balfour Declaration to create the idea of a Jewish state, which would be an outpost of subversion that the British could use as a basis of continuing the divide and conquer policy in Southwest Asia. Everywhere, divide and conquer. Then you had one that very few people know about. In the U.S. Civil War, Lord Palmerston, the foreign minister and at times prime minister, advocated to Queen Victoria that the British intervene on behalf of the Confederacy to break up the United States. Why? Because the American system was an anti-colonial system back then. The American founding fathers were serious about defeating the British Empire as an economic enforcement against the emergence of a new country. So the American Revolution, with the idea of national banking, of infrastructure investment, the idea of increasing the productivity of every citizen through technological innovation and entrepreneurship, this was the American system that the British needed to suppress in favor of the British East India Company and later the City of London control over international trade and finance. By the late 1890s, the American system was spreading to the rest of the world. You had Bismarck's Germany, which broke with British free trade policies and grew as a power. You had the Sergei Witte administration in Russia, which took the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad from Lincoln to extend to the Trans-Siberian Railroad concept, which would have connected the far reaches of East Asia, of Siberia, with Europe through Germany. You had the Sun Yat-sen movement in China, which was explicitly pro-Lincoln American system policy. And you had the Meiji Restoration in Japan. So you had this upsurge around the world of a revolt against British free trade policy. And this became the reason, the fundamental reason for World War I and World War II, to sustain the power of the British Empire. And by World War II, this incorporated American companies, corporate conglomerates, in the trust operations that led to the devastating effects of World War II, in which the Americans and the British, through people such as the Harrimans and the Bush family and Montague Norman of the Bank of England, preferred to bring Hitler in Germany to make sure that Germany would stay with the West in a war against the Soviet Union. So British geopolitics, it's the American system versus the empire. Now the problem is we no longer have the American system in the United States. We've gone over to the empire entirely. And this goes back to disputes between Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill at the end of World War II. Today we have the uniparty in the United States, where the Democrats and the Republicans are both a party of war, controlled by corporate conglomerates, including financial institutions, City of London, J.P. Morgan Chase, but also the other cartels like Big Pharma, like Vanguard, BlackRock, Archer Daniels Midland, the oil companies. You have this corporate idea, which is essentially the idea embodied in the World Economic Forum attack on sovereignty. But we're seeing something new in the revolt against it, which is the battle against globalism is not against some abstract notion of globalism, but a fight for sovereign nation states to act in the interests of their own people. And that means against the Anglo-American empire. Now, that's why the biggest threat to the world is the uniparty in the United States. Now, the question then becomes, will the U.S. population rise to the occasion and join with the anti-colonial world, with the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others, the African Union? Or will they allow its corrupt ruling class to continue to push us into one war after another until we reach the point of nuclear war? Now, that's why I asked people yesterday to do two things. One, to listen to Beethoven. And I want to read you a quote from Daniel Barenboim, who's the conductor of the Palestinian-Israeli Symphony Orchestra. Barenboim said about music, the greatness of music, and the Ninth Symphony in particular, lies in the richness of its contrasts. Think of this in terms of a dialogue of civilization. He said, music never just laughs or cries. It always laughs and cries at the same time, creating unity out of contradictions. That is Beethoven for me, said Barenboim. And he continued, music, if you study it properly, is a lesson for life. There is much we can learn from Beethoven, who is one of the strongest personalities in the history of music. He is the master of bringing emotion and intellect together. And he said later that this has something to do with the idea of the soul. Now, that's what we're talking about today, to overcome the crassness and the cheapness and the corruption and greed that dominate our culture, and instead find in the diversity of human experience in all different cultures the common interests, which mean overcoming poverty, ending war, and providing the basis for a better future for the children. That's why I urged you to listen to Beethoven and find in the incredibly beautiful movements of his Ninth Symphony a kind of inner peace and a harmony with this conception of man, as opposed to the bestial conception which exists for the empire, because it's the powers behind the empire are bestial. They truly believe in the law of the jungle and the survival of the fittest, and that they are the fittest. And that's a threat and a danger to all of us. Now, the other thing I'll just remind you again is that we have a special offer for you. There'll be in the description box, again, a subscription for 1 month free subscription to the EIR Daily Alert, Executive Intelligence Review Online Daily Alert. The idea of having real political intelligence combined with an appreciation of the beauty that's innate in each human being can give us the capability to win this fight. Also, later today, I'll be speaking with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the weekly webcast dialogue we have, and there'll be a link for that in the description section also.